Hi everyone, another thrilling World Championship game between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen has just finished in Dubai. So today was round 3 and Jan Nepomniachtchi had the white pieces. He kicks off a game with pawn to e4. Magnus repeats with e5. We have knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, a6, bishop drops back to a4, so standard Ruy Lopez moves. Now we have knight to f6, castles from Jan. Bishop to e7 from Magnus. Now rook to e1 here, pawn to b5, bishop drops back into b3, and now black castles. So this is the first interesting moment. In game 1, Jan played pawn to h3, one of the so-called anti-martial moves, because if he plays pawn to c3, which was the trend for many years, then white runs into an immediate d5 from black, and this gambit has been shown to give black very good play for the pawn. So instead of going pawn h3 today, where Magnus responded with knight a5 in the last game and got a great game really, instead Jan goes pawn to a4, the other very common anti-martial move. So what would Jan have in store? What would Magnus have prepared? Magnus goes bishop b7 now, standard development. We have pawn to d3 here, very standard move, pawn to d6. And now knight b to d2 from Jan. We've also seen bishop to d2 at many high level games, looking in this direction to prevent knight a5. There are other moves here like pawn to h3. But okay, knight b to d2, also fairly standard. So we had rook to e8 now from Magnus. Again, Magnus had choices here. He could have taken on a4, which is one way to play. Fabi was talking about how he played this back in 2014. You can go with h6 immediately. But Magnus decides to go rook e8 here. Now this does run into the immediate knight g5, attacking this sensitive f7 point. And you do wonder whether Magnus had something in store here, you know, maybe with d5 going in for some crazy tactical lines here. So Jan didn't want to walk into Magnus's preparation, so he just played the more calm move. After rook to e8, he just played knight to f1 here, carrying on with his plan and not getting into anything too tactical. Magnus now goes pawn to h6 to take away g5. We have bishop to d2 now from Jan. Bishop to f8 from Magnus, a very standard re-maneuver in the Ruy Lopez. Sometimes this pawn comes to g6. It also opens up the e-file now, so black is overprotecting this pawn with knight and rook, and therefore allowing d5 at a later point when the timing's right. We had knight to e3 now from Jan, looking at these squares, and in response to this, Magnus goes knight e7. This is a common re-maneuver, often coming to g6 and also opening up this bishop. We also note that the c pawn is now free to move, again a very common idea in these structures. And now Jan plays a really interesting move, so pawn to c4. So Jan's immediately putting the question to Magnus about how he wants to defend this b5 pawn, or if indeed Magnus wants to capture and change the pawn structure. And I think Magnus played the best move here, which is taking. If he tries to defend with say c6 or queen d7, it's perhaps getting a little bit passive and white has a lot of space in the centre. Now Jan could recapture this pawn in either way. He could go with the bishop to open up b3 then for the queen, but instead he decides to go with the knight. And the main idea of taking with the knight is to keep pressure on this e5 pawn and discourage this d5 push from happening too fast. There are also some ideas of jumping into a5 potentially. So after knight takes on c4, Magnus now plays the knight back to c6. And this isn't an obvious move at all. It closes down this bishop again, and it just looks slightly clumsy coming back to the square it's just come from. But this is obviously prepped by Magnus because he played it very quickly, and we note that today that both players were playing quickly in these positions, so obviously in prep for both players. So after knight c6 we had rook to c1, coming to that half open file. Now we had a5 from Magnus. Now this could become a weakness in future, so he has to be careful playing that, but I think he was fearing an a5 from Jan here really, because then it opens up this a4 square for the bishop to pressure down here. So Magnus goes a5 himself. We have bishop to c3 now, coming onto this nice long diagonal, again pressuring e5 and beyond. We had bishop to c8 now from Magnus, so a nice re-maneuvering move. He wants to bring his rook to the b file and open up like this, and he's noting that this is a very powerful piece which is staring in this direction, so he wants to challenge that and give his king some protection. Now we had d4 from Jan, so he immediately takes the opportunity to liberate his backwards d pawn there. Magnus captures in the centre. We have knight recaptures, knight takes, bishop takes, and now bishop to e6. A nice defensive move, solidifying everything and challenging this bishop on b3. Now Jan could jump in and take a pawn here, but this wouldn't be a good move because after c5 kicking the queen away, the queen drops back, and now after takes, we can see that this pawn is falling here. So that's why he plays pawn to h3 instead, giving his king some luft and taking away this g4 square. Now we have bishop to c6 from Magnus. He's preparing to play d5 here, so that's what this move does. It's only temporarily weakening the d6 pawn because soon that will push. We have bishop to c2 from Jan. He notes that once this centre opens, his bishop is going to be better placed looking in this direction. d5 now from Magnus. So there was a couple of different ways for Jan to respond here. He could have taken, and after say knight recaptures, he can then play a move like rook e to d1 coming to this open file, but given that the knight is bolstered by this c6 pawn, it's fairly stable there, and the position's roughly equal basically, it's just a different way to play. Instead of this, Magnus pushes on with pawn to e5. I should note that he doesn't want to move the knight away to say e5, because now he blocks his queen and bishop, also blocks the e-file for his own rook, and it's just not a sensible move. So instead he plays pawn to e5 here, counter-attacking the black knight, and both players play in the best fashion here. So Magnus takes the knight, Jan swaps off the queens now, rook recaptures, we have takes on f6, and now Magnus throws in this bishop to b4 move. So he wants to swap off this dangerous c3 bishop for the bishop which he had on f8, which was more passive, and then also he can recapture the pawn after it takes on g7. So we have pawn captures on g7, bishop takes on c3, pawn recaptures, king takes pawn. And now Jan starts bringing his king towards the centre with king f1. We had rook a to b8 coming to the open file. Jan immediately challenges that with rook to b1. King f6 coming towards the centre. The rooks get chopped off here. Magnus takes back. Rook to b1 coming to that open file. And again this pair of rooks chops off. And so the game is now firmly starting to move towards a draw. We have king to e5, king to e2, pawn to f5, bishop to c2, pawn to f4, and it might look like black is starting to make some progress, but the reality is you can never get through here because of this pawn. There's a firm wall of pawns here, and the king is completely opposite and cutting off black, so there's not much for either player to do here. We have bishop to b1, pawn to c5, bishop to c2, bishop to d7, pawn to f3, king to f6, pawn to h4, king to e5, king to f2, king to f6, and here's where the players now just shuffle towards a draw. If you've enjoyed this game and never want to miss another video, then click here to subscribe. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.